Charles Manson did not begin his story as a monster in the public imagination. He began it as a fracture, a psychological rupture formed long before the murders, long before the headlines, long before the world learned his name. Born into neglect, abandoned repeatedly, shuffled through reform schools and prisons before adulthood, Manson's identity was shaped in institutions that stripped individuality while simultaneously teaching manipulation as survival. When he later claimed, "I am a mix of Messiah and devil," it was not theatrical madness alone. It was the language of a man who had learned that identity itself was a weapon, and that myth was stronger than truth. In a society obsessed with saviors and demons, Manson understood something deeply unsettling. People do not follow goodness, they follow meaning. And meaning, especially when wrapped in cosmic language, can justify anything. His self-construction as both Christ and Satan was not random symbolism. It was a calculated psychological position that placed him above morality, beyond judgment, and outside ordinary human accountability. If he was Christ, he was righteous. If he was Satan, he was inevitable. Either way, guilt dissolved. This dual identity allowed him to reframe violence not as crime, but as cosmic necessity, not as cruelty, but as revelation. He did not see himself as evil, he saw himself as honest in a world built on lies. Manson's theology, if it can be called that, was not rooted in scripture but in cultural debris. He absorbed fragments of Christianity, Eastern philosophy, pop music, race paranoia, apocalyptic thinking, and prison survival psychology, then fused them into something uniquely American. His helter-skelter prophecy was not merely delusion, it was an ideological hallucination reinforced by confirmation bias and group reinforcement. In his mind, society was already collapsing, morality was already fake, and violence was simply the mechanism through which truth would surface. By presenting himself as both Messiah and devil, Manson eliminated contradiction. Christ destroys in Revelation. Satan tempts in Genesis. Both act as agents of transformation. Manson placed himself in that archetypal role, casting the world as fallen, corrupt, and deserving of purification. Crucially, he did not command his followers through force. He dissolved their identities until they no longer perceived themselves as separate from him. This is where the danger truly lived. His power was not charisma alone, it was ontological erasure. He taught them that the self was an illusion, that morality was a social trick, and that freedom existed only beyond guilt. Once that belief took root, violence became not just possible, but righteous. In this way, Manson functioned less like a cult leader and more like a psychological virus, rewriting the internal logic of those around him. The phrase Messiah-devil hybrid is unsettling because it reflects a deeper truth about how humans mythologize authority. Throughout history, figures who blur moral boundaries often attract the most devotion. Absolute goodness feels unreachable, absolute evil feels distant. But a figure who claims to contain both offers something intoxicating: permission. Manson offered his followers permission to abandon responsibility while feeling spiritually elevated. He framed obedience as enlightenment and doubt as weakness. When he spoke of love, it was love stripped of empathy. When he spoke of freedom, it was freedom emptied of consequence. This inversion is critical to understanding his psychology. Manson did not reject religion, he weaponized it. He did not deny God, he replaced him. By claiming to embody both Christ and Satan, he positioned himself as the final authority beyond good and evil, beyond law and punishment. This is not insanity in the clinical sense alone. It is narcissistic cosmology, the belief that the universe revolves around one's inner narrative. In interviews, Manson often spoke calmly, even poetically, about murder, as if describing weather. The attachment was not performative. It was the result of a worldview where human life held no inherent value outside symbolic function. People were not people. They were pieces in a story only he could see. What makes Charles Manson particularly disturbing is not the scale of violence. History has seen far worse, but the clarity with which he articulated his delusions. He did not rant incoherently. He spoke in paradoxes that sounded profound. He mirrored his listeners, reflected their fears back to them, and dissolved the boundary between speaker and audience. This is why his legacy persists. He is not remembered merely as a murderer, but as a symbol of something darker, the collapse of meaning itself. In the late 1960s, a period already saturated with existential uncertainty, Manson emerged as a grotesque reflection of cultural fragmentation. He exploited the failure of institutions, the hypocrisy of moral authority, and the hunger for transcendence. When he said he was both Christ and Satan, he was not asking to be believed literally. He was declaring that truth itself had become subjective, that identity was malleable, and that morality could be rewritten by whoever spoke with enough conviction. This is the real horror of Manson. Not the knife, but the idea. Not the blood, but the permission. He revealed how easily humans surrender their conscience when someone promises them cosmic significance. After the murders, Charles Manson ceased to be merely a man and became a cultural artifact. The media did what media always does when faced with incomprehensible violence. It simplified, dramatized, and mythologized. Manson was transformed into a shorthand for evil, a living emblem of chaos, a face onto which society could project its terror. In doing so, something uncomfortable was lost. By turning him into a caricature of madness, the public avoided confronting the conditions that made him possible. The story became about a monster rather than a mirror. Manson, seated calmly in court, carving symbols into his forehead, smiling at cameras, understood this process intuitively. He leaned into the role. If society wanted a devil, he would give them one. If they needed a villain to restore the illusion that evil is rare and external, he would embody it completely. In this sense, the system rewarded him with immortality. His name outlived his crimes. His image eclipsed his victims. This is not because he was powerful, but because modern culture feeds on symbols more than substance. Manson's Messiah Devil identity fit perfectly into a media landscape that thrives on extremes. He became proof that evil could be isolated in one body, safely caged, safely othered. The more monstrous he appeared, the less society had to ask itself difficult questions about alienation, authority, obedience, and moral responsibility. Yet beneath the spectacle, Manson's philosophy continued to rot quietly in the cultural subconscious. The idea that morality is artificial, that truth is personal, that identity is fluid and self-created, these ideas did not die with him. In fact, they flourished. Manson did not invent moral relativism, but he demonstrated its darkest application. When all values are subjective, power fills the vacuum. When truth becomes narrative, the loudest voice wins. When identity is untethered from accountability, charisma becomes destiny. Manson's followers did not commit violence because they were inherently evil. They committed violence because they surrendered judgment. They outsourced conscience to someone who promised certainty. This is the enduring danger. Not cults in the traditional sense, but belief systems that dissolve responsibility while offering belonging. Manson's rhetoric stripped individuals of agency while convincing them they were finally free. This paradox remains deeply attractive in times of confusion. People crave absolution from complexity. They want simple answers to unbearable questions. Figures like Manson thrive where institutions fail to provide meaning, where authority feels hollow, and where individuals feel invisible. His legacy is not about Satanism or messianic delusion alone. It is about the psychological hunger to escape ambiguity at any cost. The question that lingers is not why Manson believed he was both Christ and the devil, but why others were willing to entertain the idea. His claim worked because it resonated with something already fractured in the collective psyche. Western culture, especially in the 20th century, oscillates between moral absolutism and moral nihilism. Manson stood at the intersection of both. He spoke in biblical tones while rejecting biblical morality. He invoked love while endorsing annihilation. He preached unity while orchestrating destruction. This contradiction did not repel his followers, it mesmerized them. Humans are drawn to paradox when reality feels incoherent. The Messiah Devil archetype collapses moral tension into a single figure, relieving the believer of the burden of discernment. If the leader contains both good and evil, then any action can be justified as part of a higher synthesis. This is how atrocities are committed without hatred. This is how violence becomes ritual. This is how conscience dissolves into obedience. Manson's story exposes a brutal truth. Evil does not require monsters. It requires systems of belief that deactivate empathy while preserving a sense of righteousness. In the end, Charles Manson's declaration, "I am a mix of Messiah and devil," was neither prophecy nor confession. It was a symptom. A symptom of a culture that struggles to reconcile freedom with responsibility, individuality with ethics, rebellion with humanity. Manson was not the source of this tension, he was its distortion. He took the unresolved questions of his time and turned them into a personal mythology that justified domination and death. His life serves as a warning, not about Satan, not about God, but about meaning itself. When meaning is severed from compassion, when identity is severed from accountability, when truth is reduced to performance, the door opens to figures who claim transcendence while delivering ruin. Manson did not reveal the nature of evil as something foreign. He revealed it as something disturbingly familiar. The human desire to feel significant without being responsible, enlightened without being ethical, chosen without being humble. His story ends not with his death, but with a question that remains unresolved. How many people are willing to surrender their conscience to someone who promises them purpose? And how often do we mistake certainty for truth, charisma for wisdom, and mythology for meaning?